Well, what I saw with DeSantis was he had a concern that it wasn't just black history that they were putting into this critical race theory, but that he saw that there was queer theory, which was in this thing that they were teaching in school. And like, how does that have anything to do with black history? Like, why is queer theory inserted into
well,
that?
I think the way those are linked is essentially through what you might regard as, well, it's an implicit Marxism, but it's even deeper than Marxism. So if you're a Marxist, you have a heuristic that simplifies the world, and that heuristic is that you can understand any social relationship from an intimate relationship all the way up to the state by just dividing the parties, let's call them the narrative partners in a discussion or an interaction, into those who are oppressed and victimized and those who are taking advantage of them and profiting. That's basic Marxist theory of economics. And there's obviously some truth in that, because when systems become corrupt, that's how they operate, right? It's exploitation and victimization. And every system tends towards corruption. And if your eyes are open a little bit, or if you've moved from naivety to cynicism, then you can see every interaction as a power dynamic. And then that drives, as soon as you have that established, that idea that the basic relationship is one of power, well, then you can see, well, there's no difference between what's happened to queer people in relationship to those in power and what's happened to black people in relationship to those in power. But it's united by that underlying, that's why I always make a case for the domination of something like postmodernism and Marxism. I've been criticized for that, but I think it's an accurate association. The postmodernists figured out, and they were right about this, that we see the world through a story. Now, that turns out to be something unbelievably complicated, and I think all the top-end neuroscientists like Carl Friston are, what would you call, converging on this presumption that you have to see the world through a story. And the postmodernists actually figured that out. The French postmodernists, Foucault and Derrida and people like that. But then they did something that was a sleight of hand. And this all happened in the 1970s. They said, well, we have to see the world through a story. And even if you're a scientist, you're not exactly objective, because there's a narrative driving your work that you might be unaware of. That's your implicit narrative. That's what might be implicitly biasing you. But they jumped to the conclusion that the underlying narrative was one of power. It's basically that all human relationships are predicated on power. And, there isn't a more cynical viewpoint than that. And it's easy to take apart, if you think about it for a moment in a practical sense. If your marriage is just based on power, first of all, it's an unpleasant place because it's tyrant and slave. And second, good luck with that, because people aren't that easy to tyrannize, maybe you have a willing slave in your wife, but I doubt it. If you're just trying to play power games with her, she's going to fight back with everything she's got. And then if you have friends, it's like, that's a relationship of mutual exploitation, is it? Then you're just a bully with henchmen, and they're going to stab you in the back the first chance they get.
You're a mob man. You're a mob leader.
Yeah. Well, worse than that even.
A dictator.
You're a dictator. You're a dictator, and people say, well, look at how successful dictator psychopaths can be, but I look at them and I think, well, that's your definition of success.
Yeah, man. What is success? I mean, how are you
the biggest devil
fulfilled?
in hell.
Yeah, are you happy?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
well, the leader of a bad place might be the person who's worst off.
Yeah.
In some fundamental sense, right? They're the most corrupt.
Isn't that funny, though, that the way we define success is power and money? Those are you look how successful they are.
Yeah.
Power and money. Well, a complete absence of love and trust and respect and
it's
basic human dignity.
Well, it's also not really how people operate. So there's an anthropological literature on the formation of elders in traditional societies, because you might ask yourself, who becomes an elder? And if you were a Marxist cynic, you'd say, well, those who used exploitation to dominate, like the priestly class or something like that. And that goes along with the supposition that, religion is the opiate of the masses. And some of that's obviously true, but a lot of it isn't. The elders aren't that at all. They're the people who others go to spontaneously to ask for counsel.
Yeah.
And then you ask, well, who do people naturally gravitate towards for counsel? And the answer is, well, productive, generous people who've managed their interpersonal relationships well. because who the hell else would you go ask for advice if you had any sense? Like, you might go ask the local dictator and kowtow to him if you need a favor to take somebody out. But if you're actually asking for counsel, you're going to ask someone who's decent and who's generous and who plays a reciprocal game. And it's also the case, this is worth knowing too, the problem with a power game is that it's not playable, not in the final analysis. So Frans de Waal, the Dutch primatologist, has showed even pretty clearly in chimpanzees, you think the roughest, toughest chimpanzee rules the damn roost, and he pounds everybody flat and he gets access to the females. And there's a little bit of truth to that, because female chimps aren't sexually choosy, but the male chimps will chase weaker males away from them. And so if you are more powerful physically as a male chimp, you do have preferential mating access. But the problem with being a brute, even if you're a chimp, is that you have an off day and two of the chimps that you oppressed band together and tear you into pieces. And so what de Waal found was that in chimp troops, the stable alpha can sometimes even be the smallest male of the troop. He'll ally himself with some of the dominant females and makes networks that are essentially friendships, reciprocal friendships. And that gives him a stable position, not of power, but of authority. And that's definitely the case in functional human societies. It's not based on power. Now, it's tricky, because if it degenerates, then it degenerates into a relationship of power. And so that means the critics who make the claim that everything's about power are right in some sense when they're talking about nothing but corruption, but they're really 100% seriously wrong about the idea that it's power relation that constitutes the basis for the organization of any social interaction. It doesn't work in your marriage, doesn't work with your friends, doesn't work with your children, doesn't work with your business partners, doesn't work with your customers, it doesn't work with politicians.